The heat in Lancaster County that August was not merely a weather pattern. It was a physical burden, a heavy, invisible yoke that rested on the shoulders of every living thing. It had been 6 weeks since the last true rain, and the earth had turned to something brittle and unforgiving. The soil, usually a rich chocolate brown, was now the color of old ash, cracking open in jagged fissures that looked like thirsty mouths gasping for water. Abram Stoltzfus woke before the alarm clock could ring, as he had every morning for 40 years. It was 3:45 a.m. The air inside the farmhouse was stagnant, trapped in the upper bedrooms like heat in an oven. Even the sheets felt warm to the touch. He lay there for a moment in the darkness, listening. Usually, the house breathed the settling of timber, the rustle of wind, but tonight, the silence was absolute. It was a suffocating, heavy silence that pressed against his ear. Beside him, his wife, Hannah, breathed in a shallow, rhythmic cycle. In the dim moonlight, filtering through the sheer curtains, he could see the sheen of perspiration on her forehead. She had been canning peaches all day yesterday, standing over a boiling water bath in a kitchen that must have reached 100 degrees. She was a strong woman, Hannah. Her hands were rougher than silk, but her touch was the anchor of his life. He whispered a silent prayer of gratitude for her rest, swinging his legs out of bed and placing his feet on the wooden floorboards. He dressed in the dark, his fingers finding the buttons of his shirt by memory. The denim of his trousers was soft from countless washings, but today it felt heavy. He didn't light the kerosene lamp on the dresser. To light a lamp was to invite the heat, and there was already too much of that. He moved through the hallway, stepping over the creaky board on the 3rd step, a ghost in his own home. Downstairs, the kitchen smelled of vinegar and stale coffee. The pilot light on the gas stove was a tiny blue eye staring back at him in the dark. Abram went to the back door, opening it to the porch. He expected a reprieve, a cool breeze, but the air outside was thicker than the air inside. It smelled of dust and dried corn stalks. He walked to the edge of the porch and looked out toward the barn. It was a massive shadow against the stars. The bank barn his grandfather had built in 1922. It was the cathedral of his farm. The bottom level was stone, whitewashed and cool, where the cows slept. The upper level was timber, soaring and vast, filled with the smell of sweet hay and stored grain. It was more than a building. It was the bank vault, the history book, and the heart of the Stoltzfus legacy. Abram stepped into his work boots, the leather cracked and worn. He walked across the yard, the dry grass crunching loudly under his feet. In the distance, a dog barked, a lonely, hollow sound that carried 4 miles in the dead air. He looked at his cornfields. Even in the dark, he could feel their suffering. The stalks were stunted, the leaves curled tight like clenched fists. If rain did not come soon, there would be no harvest. And without a harvest, there would be no money for the taxes, no money for the new seed, no money for the winter flour. Inside the barn, the air was pungent with the scent of ammonia and warm animal bodies. The cows were awake. They shifted in their stanchions, the metal chains clinking softly. They sensed the pressure in the air, too. Animals always know before men do. "Guten Morgen," Bessie Abram whispered, running his hand along the flank of his lead Holstein. Her coat was damp with sweat. She let out a low, unhappy rumble. "I know, old girl. I know. It is too hot to sleep." He grabbed the stainless steel pail and the small 3-legged stool. He pressed his forehead against the cow's warm side and began to milk. Ping, ping, swish. Swish! The rhythm took over. This was his meditation. For the Amish, prayer was not always words spoken on knees. Often it was the work of the hands performed with a yielded heart. But this morning, Abram's heart was not yielded. It was anxious. His mind wandered to his eldest son, Levi. Levi was 19, deep in his room Springather running around time. He was working for an English construction crew, driving a truck, wearing clothes with zippers, and carrying a smartphone. Abram worried about the boy's soul. The world out there was loud and shiny. Would Levi see the beauty in this quiet, hard life, or would he choose the easy road of the English? The barn door creaked open. It was Samuel, his second son, followed by young Isaac. They looked tired, their eyes puffy with sleep, their suspenders hanging loosely over their shoulders. "The air feels heavy, Dad," Samuel said, grabbing a pitchfork. "It is a storm breeder," Abram replied, not looking up from the milk stream. "The pressure is dropping." "Will it rain?" Isaac asked, hope in his young voice. "We pray for rain," Abram said, "but in this heat we must watch for hail and wind." They worked in silence for an hour. The only sounds the chewing of the cows and the scrape of shovels. When the chores were done, they walked back to the house as the sun began to rise. But it was not a golden sunrise. It was a red, angry wound in the eastern sky, bleeding orange light into the haze. Breakfast was a quiet affair. Hannah had made cornmeal mush and fried eggs. The coffee was hot and strong, but Abram drank it without tasting it. The table was set with the blue and white plates they had used for 20 years. The children, 3 boys and 2 girls. Quickly, "The English weather report says severe storms," Hannah said softly, pouring more coffee. She didn't listen to the radio, but the neighbor, Mrs. Lapp, had told her over the fence. "We will secure the machinery," Abram said, wiping his beard. "Put the buggy in the shed. Close the shutters on the west side." By noon, the sky had turned a sickly, bruised purple. The wind died completely. The leaves on the oak tree by the driveway hung limp, as if holding their breath. The birds stopped singing. Even the flies, usually a torment in August, seemed to vanish. Abram was in the workshop, repairing a harness, when the first thunder cracked. It didn't roll. It snapped like a cannon shot, vibrating the tools on the wall. He walked to the door. The western horizon was a wall of black, advancing across the cornfields like an invading army. Lightning flickered within the clouds, constant and frantic, like a strobe light. "It comes," he said to himself. He ran toward the house. "Hannah, get the girls inside. Samuel." The horses. The wind hit them. A moment later, it wasn't a breeze. It was a physical blow. The dust from the road rose up in a blinding, choking wall. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in 10 seconds. The laundry and the line whipped violently, horizontal to the ground. Abram fought his way to the barn. He had to check the latches. The wind howled through the slats, making the massive structure groan. He was halfway across the yard when the world turned white. There was no gap between the flash and the sound. A blinding pillar of light, hotter than the surface of the sun, slammed into the peak of the barn roof. The concussion knocked Abram off his feet, face first into the dirt. The ground shook. He scrambled up, ears ringing, disoriented. He looked up. Smoke. Not the gray smoke of damp wood, but the black, oily smoke of old timber and dry hay. A tongue of orange flame licked up from the cupola, bright against the black storm clouds. Abram screamed, the sound tearing at his throat. "Fire! Samuel! Isaac!" The terror of a barn fire is not the heat, it is the speed. A barn is a chimney. The hayloft, filled with tons of dried grass, is the fuel. The draft from the open doors feeds the oxygen. It is a perfect machine for destruction. Abram sprinted to the stable doors. He threw them open. The smoke was already rolling along the ceiling, a thick, gray blanket. The sound of the fire upstairs was a low, terrifying roar, like a train passing overhead. The animals were screaming. The horses were thrashing in their stalls, their eyes rolling white with primal panic. "Cover their eyes," Abram roared to Samuel, who had appeared beside him. "They won't move if they see the fire. Use your shirt." Abram ripped his own shirt off, tearing the buttons. He wrapped it around the head of Sarah, the lead draft mare. She was 1,800 pounds of muscle, and she was terrified. He grabbed her halter. "Come, Sarah, come." He dragged her. She planted her feet, sliding in the straw. He slapped her hard on the flank, screaming in a voice he didn't recognize. She lunged forward, nearly trampling him. He guided her out into the wind and the dust, releasing her into the pasture. Erong, back in. The heat was now physical, searing the hair on his arms. Embers were raining down through the floorboards, burning holes in the straw bedding. The roar was deafening. The cows. Isaac was crying, trying to undo the chains. "Cut 'em loose!" Abram yelled. "Don't unlatch! Use the bolt cutters!" They worked like madmen in the smoke. One by one, the cows scrambled out, slipping on the concrete, vanishing into the smoke-filled yard. The ceiling above them began to sag. A massive beam, glowing red, cracked with the sound of a gunshot. "Out!" Abram grabbed Isaac by the suspenders. "Everyone out! Now!" They tumbled out of the stable door, coughing, their lungs burning. They ran 10 yards, then turned. With a groan that sounded like a dying giant, the roof of the barn collapsed. A massive geyser of sparks and flames shot hundreds of feet into the air, swirling in the wind. The heat was so intense it forced them back, shielding their faces. Hannah was standing by the garden gate, clutching the 2 youngest girls. They were all weeping. The fire department, the English volunteers with their sirens wailing, arrived 10 minutes later. But there was nothing to do. The fire was a beast that had already eaten its fill. They sprayed water on the house to save the siding, but they let the barn burn. And the cruelest irony of all, it never rained. The storm brought wind and fire, but not a drop of water. The night that followed was the longest of Abram's life. The fire burned down to a glowing pit of coals. The smell was acrid wet charcoal, burnt grain, and the sweetness of destruction. The neighbors had come, standing in silent vigils by the fence, their buggies parked in rows. They offered no platitudes. They simply offered presents. Abram sat on the porch steps, his face blackened with soot, his hands blistered. He watched the ruins of his grandfather's legacy. He felt a hollowness in his chest that was terrifying. He felt abandoned. "Why, Lord?" he asked the darkness. "I have kept the old ways. I have raised my children in the faith. Why take my livelihood?" Hannah sat beside him, placing her hand on his knee. She didn't speak. Say, just sat. By 4 a.m., the time he usually woke to milk, Abram was still sitting there. He had nothing to milk. The cows were scattered in the lower pasture. The milking equipment was melted, twisted metal. He stood up. "I will go check the foundation," he croaked. "Abram, rest," Hannah whispered. "I must know if the stone held," he said. He walked to the smoking pit. The heat was still radiating from the stones. He walked the perimeter. The limestone walls, built by hand a century ago, were scorched black, but they were straight. They had not buckled. The foundation stood. As the sun began to rise, a clear, mocking blue sky, Abram heard a sound. Clip-clop, clip-clop, he turned. A single black buggy was coming down the long driveway. Then another, then three, then a wagon. Abram watched, stunned. From T-Est, a flatbed truck, driven by a Mennonite neighbor, rumbled in, piled high with yellow pine lumber. From T-West, a procession of buggies that stretched as far as the eye could see. Men were jumping out before the buggies even stopped. Men with tool belts, men with saws, men with lunch pails. Bishop Amos, 80 years old and bent like a gnarled root, walked up to Abram. He didn't say, "I'm sorry." He looked at the stone foundation. "It is good stone," the bishop said. Abram nodded, tears cutting clean tracks through the soot on his cheeks. "It is good stone." "Then we build," the bishop said. He turned to the crowd. There were over 300 men now, a sea of straw hats and suspenders. "We clear the ash first," the bishop shouted. It was not a mob. It was an army. 50 men moved instantly to the ruins with shovels and wheelbarrows. They worked with a synchronized rhythm, clearing the debris. The blackened wood was hauled away. The twisted metal was stacked. Another group, the framers, began unloading the lumber. The sound of saws filled the air. Zip, zip, zip. The smell of fresh pine mingled with the smell of ash. It was the smell of resurrection. Abram tried to pick up a shovel, but his brother Thomas took it from him. "Not today, Abram," Thomas said gently. "Today you are the host. We are the hands." By 9 a.m., the subfloor was laid. By 10 a.m., the women had set up a tent on the lawn. Hannah, energized by the sight, directed a kitchen crew of 50 women. The tables groaned under the weight of the food. Roast beef, ham, buttered noodles, chochu, pickled beets, 7 kinds of pie. The smell of coffee and donuts wafted over the construction site. At noon, the bents went up. This was the most dangerous and beautiful part of the frolic. The bent is the skeletal frame of the barn waltons of timber assembled on the ground. The foreman shouted, "Are we ready?" "Ja!" yelled 300 voices. "Heave!" The men lifted. The timber groaned. "Heave!" It rose to 45 degrees. Men with pike poles pushed from the bottom. Ropes pulled from the other side. "Heave!" It snapped upright, locking into the mortise joints with a thud that could be felt in the ground. Men swarmed up the timber like squirrels, fearless, walking on beams 6 inches wide, 30 feet in the air. They drove the wooden pegs home with massive mallets called beetles. Whack, whack, whack. Abram stood back, watching. He saw Levi, his wayward son, up on the highest beam. Levi wasn't looking at his phone. He wasn't slouching. He was swinging a hammer, laughing with his cousin, balancing against the blue sky. Abram saw the pride in his son's posture. He realized Levi didn't need the world. He just needed a purpose. By 4 p.m., the roof trusses were set. The tin sheeting was being nailed down. The sound was a metallic drum. The barn was no longer a ruin. It was a structure. It was bigger, stronger, and brighter than the one that had burned. As the sun began to set, casting long golden shadows across the trampled yard, the men came down from the ladders. They were covered in sawdust and sweat. They were exhausted, but their eyes were bright. The bishop called for silence. 300 men stood in the yard. They took off their hats. They didn't clap. They didn't shake hands. They sang. They sang the livelihood, the slow, chanting hymn of praise that has been sung for 500 years. O God Bater, wir loben dich. The sound was guttural, deep a masculine harmony that resonated in Abram's chest. It was a sound that said, "We are distinct. We are separate. We are one." Abram looked at the new barn. He looked at his neighbors. He realized that the fire had taken his wood and his hay, but it had given him back his faith. He had thought he was alone in the dark. But he was held by a safety net woven of brotherhood and tradition. The crowd began to disperse. Buggies pulled away, lanterns twinkling in the dusk. Abram and Hannah stood on the porch, alone again. The air was still hot, but then a drop of water hit the dusty porch rail. Then a note. Then a hiss as rain hit the hot tin of the new roof. "Abram," Hannah whispered, "listen." It began to pour, a steady, soaking, beautiful rain. It wasn't a violent storm. It was a healing rain. It washed the dust from the corn. It washed the soot from the grass. Abram walked out into the yard. He turned his face to the sky and let the water soak him. He opened his mouth and tasted it. Cool. Sweet. He looked at the new barn, standing strong in the rain. He had lost a building, but he had found his church.